welcome to Monsters and Multiclass, your Dungeons & Dragons fix. I'm Ellioti.
I'm Jared Bornagle.
And I'm Will Meldon.
And we'll be hanging out with you for a while to talk about anything and everything D&D related. On this episode, we are diving into madness. What works, what doesn't, what we want to see done, what can we borrow from other systems. And we brought help, because this is kind of like uncharted territory from us. We have Matt from Roleplay chat here. Matt, if you want to do your thing.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Matt. Now I guess I'm like the resident madness expert. I don't know what that says about me, but no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I'm Matt, and I have a podcast called Roleplay Chat, where I have guests join me on a bi-weekly basis, and we take unscripted deep dives on tabletop RPG subjects. So I'm happy to be here. This sounds like it's up my alley, so I'm really looking forward to joining you guys. As far as role-playing games go, I've been playing for a little over 10 years now. D&D 4th edition was where I cut my teeth as a game master and started game mastering. But I've played and game mastered a number of other systems, including the Fate core system, which is currently my favorite, and I'm going to talk a little bit about today, probably. I've also played some Warhammer fantasy roleplay, which is kind of like Cthulhu meets fantasy, so it's also has some relevance there. I'm not too familiar with the rules. I've only ever been a player, so I'll do my best. And and Call of Cthulhu, which is another relevant madness-based system. So we'll see how it goes. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, and seriously, thanks for joining. And you don't worry, you don't have to be a madness expert. But anytime the topic comes up throughout this entire episode labeled madness, we are going to refer back to you and ask for confirmation about what we say. So if that makes you an expert, then I guess that makes you an expert. All right, so with that, madness. Madness in D&D is often used to convey the feeling of psychological horror. Usually in D&D, PCs will see terrifying monsters or situation, and there's no mechanical representation of how it affects them unless we use the optional rule set of madness or something else. But again, going by what's in the DMG, the Dungeon Master's Guide, there is a section regarding madness that talks about how you can use it in your game. And it should go without saying before we even dive into this topic that if you're going to use madness in your game, if you're going to have psychological horror in your game, talk to your players. This is a session 0 conversation, or if it's something you're bringing up in the middle of a long-term campaign, it's, again, something to bring up beforehand. You don't want to go into this blind. You don't want your players to go into this blind. That's just not great for your table. So we probably won't be saying 500 times, talk about it in session 0. This is like the blanket time to bring it up now. Talk about this in session 0.
Yes, and it's usually dealing with heavy, kind of more difficult things when you do bring it up in your game and players are going mad, whatever that really means. So yes, get the buy-in. I don't think, as you said though, I don't think we need to say that 100 times throughout the episode.
Yeah. If I could add one thing, I think safety tools, I'll make a plug for safety tools, because people can agree to something in session 0 and not really know what they're agreeing to until you pull out something really spooky, scary, and hits really close to home. So, I mean, I'm not going to say which safety tools you should use at your table because I don't know your players, but look them up, make sure you propose them at the very least, and encourage your players to use them.
Yes. And from a less, we'll say, emotional level, even just from a pure player level, a reason to bring it up beforehand is that madness oftentimes can permanently alter a player character. And if that's not how people want to play their character and they want to have pure agency in every single one of their decisions, even that might be a reason to bring it up and make sure that you're all on the same page. You can all have the most steeled minds and not have anything bother you, but if you're happy-go-lucky PC turns into somebody who loves to eat corpses, you're probably going to be a little bit upset at the change if it wasn't discussed beforehand. So with that out of the way, let's talk about madness. And to start off, I think just our I guess to go over the rules in the DMG, and after I've done a ton of talking, Ellie, would you be so kind as to maybe go over that in your way?
Sure. Yeah, the madness effects in the DMG are really straightforward. You have short-term, long-term, and indefinite madness. It's up to the DM of when it's applied, it's usually a wisdom, or if you fail a wisdom or charisma save and you're using madness, then you apply one. You pick the length of time based on what's appropriate. Short term is 1d10 minutes, long term is 1d10 times 10 hours, and indefinite is until cured. And there's charts in here you could roll on, D100 tables, or you obviously can make your own. Just some quick examples for like short-term madness. If you roll a 1 through 20, the character retreats into his or her mind and becomes paralyzed. The effect ends if the character takes any damage. 61 through 70, the character experiences vivid hallucinations and has a disadvantage on his ability checks. Or 91 through 100, the character falls unconscious. And again, these are 1d10 minutes measured in minutes. Long-term madness could look like the character experiences vivid hallucinations and has, oh, that's the same. I randomly just grabbed a row and it's the exact same one as above, just 1d10 times 10 hours instead of minutes. That's not fun. We'll pick another one. The character experiences a powerful delusion. Choose a potion. The character imagines that he or she is under its effects. The character loses their ability to speak. The character can feel spelled to repeat a specific activity over and over, such as washing hands, etc. And just to wrap it up, indefinite madness, these are flaws. So if you're familiar with like the background kind of character creation area where like you fill in flaws and it has kind of this way of, the player's handbook has this way of writing it, it's kind of the same thing. So these are things like being drunk keeps me sane. There's only one person I can trust and only I can see the special friend. I find it hard to care about anything that goes on around me. And so on.
Right away, something I find very interesting is that the first two tables all give these kind of mechanical representations, and then the indefinite madnesses, all of them are pure role-playing. There's no mechanical backing to it, which, I mean, that's obviously intended. I don't even have opinions on it. It's just kind of neat that that's how it's split up.
Yeah, I mean, you say you don't have opinions, Jared, but I mean, how can you not have opinions? It's fascinating to me how they've separated this out, first and foremost, because I'm not even sure I would categorize being like rendered mad if it lasts for 1d10 minutes.
No.
Like, is that really madness? Is it? I don't think it is. But I find it funny. Even like long-term madness, that, you know, it's categorized as something that's long-term, but I'd love to hear how you guys feel about its duration. You know, on the shorter end of that spectrum, you're talking about 10 hours. Is that really long-term?
No,
I don't know. I have my hesitations there.
Yeah, I would expect long-term madness to be more categorized in days, but I think this is one of the issues we'll keep butting up against with the concept of madness as presented here, is that it's really trying to center around the adventuring day idea. So if this would be like, you know, short-term madness is, it might be one encounter. Then long-term madness is, it might be until you take a long rest. And then indefinite, obviously, is forever. But that feels weird. I mean, you're totally right with this concept of madness and what it could be. That just feels very short.
And I think that's actually an appropriate length of time, because like you asked, is that really long term? It's like, how many combats are you going to be going through? It's not, but it could be absolutely catastrophic. Being blind for 7 hours is absolutely horrible for pretty much every single character, should they be engaged in any kind of hostile activity.
It's a good point. Like, from a purely mechanical standpoint, these effects are incredibly debilitating. I guess my qualm is with the slap of the tag of madness. You know, is if we're talking about rendering someone mad and having them go losing their sanity to the point that they're repeating the same sentence over and over and over and over again, that doesn't feel like an effect that would just magically disappear after 7 hours. But I agree with you, Will. You know, in a combat simulator, in a game where you're doing a dungeon dive or something like that, it's definitely something you don't want to be too hard on your players either, I guess, is one way to say it. But
yeah, I think it's trying to strike that good balance of not feeling like a somewhat realistic idea, but not being completely punishing, just destroying a character. And so the short term, I think, can actually make a lot of sense of this like really burst of just like, got so overwhelmed and so horrified with whatever just happened to you, your brain shuts down. and you temporarily like lose consciousness, stunned, frightened, incapacitated, babble incoherently for like X amount of minutes, and then there's enough time to kind of remove and start processing it, and your party kind of rallies around you and helps you out. You can sort of calm down and come back to your senses. I think in less extreme versions, that's something everyone could relate to. Long term, though, that one fits in an awkward zone. Because it's a lot of the same effects as short term, just stretched out longer.
Yeah, and the idea, again, of it just kind of finishing always feels weird to me. Mentioning like, oh yeah, it just magically ends after so many hours. Well, it can magically end much earlier than that with literal magic, which also can feel really weird and can make this ability, this entire concept of madness feel not very threatening at all, which makes it not even a good tool from a challenge standpoint, as well as not being a fantastic role-playing tool either. When you look at Curing Madness, which we didn't specifically bring up yet, so I'll summarize, is a Calm Emotion spell can suppress the effects of madness, assume for the duration of Calm Emotions, which is 1 minute, while a Lesser Restoration spell can rid a character of short or long-term madness. Just like that, a second-level spell that many classes get access to, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Paladin, Ranger, Artificer, and a couple... I think the Celestial as well, Warlock, all have access to this Lesser Restoration spell. And boom, just like that long-term madness that we were so worried about, second level spell, and it's forgotten.
Mm-hmm. And then even Indefinite Madness could be cured by like Remove Curse, Dispel Evil and Good, or then Greater Restoration. Which if it's a real low-level campaign, Greater Restoration's hard to come by. But again, that's another one where a lot of classes get it. Bard, Cleric, Druid, Artificer, Peace Domain, and the Celestial Warlock again.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to... I mean, I haven't combed through the monster manual or what kind of scenarios might create Indefinite Madness. But like, in terms of a campaign, I presume that's not going to be happening in the first 3 or 4 levels anyway. You know, it's going to be happening in late game when the PCs probably have an NPC healer friend that they can go to if they really needed to. You know, they're going to have the tools at their disposal to rid themselves of something like this in a pretty easy way. So yeah, I agree with you, Jared. It doesn't feel as permanent as it should, or it doesn't feel as threatening, at least, as it should.
It doesn't, and to add another adjective onto that, it doesn't feel as impactful as it should. Because to me, when we're playing with this idea of, we'll say mental illness, I mean, it's what madness is trying to play up. The idea that you can just snap your fingers and be rid of it brings up a lot of issues for me.
And I could see them, why they want to make it an easy thing to get rid of in like your heroic D&D game, because D&D is kind of like a heroic simulator. And so it's like, all right, this isn't real life. We can't just magically cure this. But so if you're players and you're a table that does not want that like reminder of like, okay, this is like a big problem and hard to actually manage, may never even be able to really get rid of, then you're probably not someone who's going to use the optional madness rules anyways.
Right, but there are other games that I'm sure we'll be talking about that do a better job of again, making it more than literally snapping your fingers.
Right. And people play the Call of Cthulhu, Mothership. I know people will play those games, and we've played them to kind of feel like that struggling, powerless person, like trying to overcome some greater thing and just barely scraping by. I think most people play D&D for the heroics. And now obviously there's exceptions. That's not a blanket statement. But that is kind of what the core engine is built around. And then the madness, if you strip it out where it's this permanent thing, like Greater Restoration and Lesser Restoration doesn't get rid of it, it does kind of very much go against that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you're right, it's the tone. Madness is a thing that you would be including if the tone of your game is going to be a horror type game. It's going to be a game that you want to have those struggles. I guess I just feel like it's a little half baked, and maybe we've been bashing madness a little too much. Like I feel like I owe it to bring up some of the positives. If you guys are okay with that, unless we have more bashing to do.
We don't do that on this podcast.
No, please.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's when you look at some of the effects in the random table, and making the effects of madness random is a whole other ballpark. But if we take that aside and we look at some of the effects in the list, there's some of them that are kind of fun. Like they spark a little bit of role play. They spark the imagination. There's one in the long-term madness table where you have like a lucky charm, and I forget exactly what it is. Ellie, do you mind reading it out to us?
I got it. The character becomes attached to a lucky
it.
charm, such as a person or an object, and has disadvantage on attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws while more than 30 feet from it.
Yeah, so like this is an example, I think, that it has the mechanical aspect where you want to make sure you stay close to your lucky charm. The game master could toy with you and try to remove you from your lucky charm. But there's also a role play element where the player gets to decide what that lucky charm is. The player probably can work with the rest of the party to figure that out and to role play specifically their attachment. So it kind of hits both axes, where you've got the tactical mechanical elements, but you've also opened up doors for role play. And there's a handful of these in these tables that do that.
Mm-hmm.
There's others that don't, where it's like you're unconscious forever and deal with it. But there are others that are a little bit more involved and a little bit more exciting. So I think we can say that they struck a good balance on those particular ones, I suppose.
I totally agree. The ones that do, the ones that if you got them, you wouldn't immediately say, let's stop adventuring until we cure this, are the ones that I consider good. Because Will, you mentioned this earlier, being blind for 10 hours kind of puts a damper on your adventuring day if you're going to slay some beast of some sort. Whereas this, it's like, okay, that's a problem, but is it such a big problem we need to solve it right now? No. And those, I think, are, even just if we went through the table and just took out all the ones that were kind of day stoppers and put in things like that, I think Madness would feel a lot better.
The day stopper ones could get really interesting in the right situation. Like if you're deep in a dangerous dungeon and someone goes blind for 7 hours, it's like you can't just stop. That's a danger in itself.
Right, but if
so
they
then
fall,
you get this interesting. But yeah, if you're like out in the woods and traveling or in town, it's like, yeah, just take the day off.
I would say, but what if like you fall unconscious, and then no amount of jostling or damage can wake the character? You don't have an option.
Oh,
at
that's
that
a
point.
long-term one, isn't it?
Yeah,
that could be 100 hours. Holy crap!
Right. So like when you even have those as an option,
some of these are problems.
It's like you either A, cast Lesser Restoration and get rid of it and forget that this whole thing ever happened, or B, have to completely end the adventuring day. And those ones kind of lose me.
No, there's C, and this is where it becomes an issue. C, the adventuring day continues, everybody dies. That's not fun. I mean, it can be if you're looking for that kind of experience, but I think most tables, that's just going to be very upsetting and not in a kind of betrayal way. It's like, what did I do that combat? Well, they had to drag me to the next one. I wasn't there, and we all got killed because I couldn't do anything.
Yeah,
that's where it really gets you. When your cleric falls unconscious for 77 hours, it's like, Madness got a lot scarier. And didn't materially get scarier, just because of a weird quirk of the system got scarier.
Or D, you use the Lesser Restoration to cure it, and you just make it a cool roleplay moment. The person, they start kind of acting funny and pass out as the brain shuts down, as they just can't comprehend what's happening. Somebody rushes over, casts Lesser Restoration, they come to, there's a cool, sweet role-playing moment as the party talks it through with them, and they calm down and then keep moving. That could be okay, too.
Or E. No, I don't have an E. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways that it can be handled, a lot of ways it can play out, and it does put a lot of onus on the player to role play it correctly. Correctly is a strong word for it, but to take advantage of the role playing opportunity.
Yeah, Matt, I think you mentioned it being random is somewhat problematic, and I'm with you. Yeah, that makes it really tough. Just these D100 tables and
Yeah,
Sometimes it
I have
makes
my
no
qualms
sense.
with random things in general, but you're right. Like, and sorry to interrupt you. Please continue.
No, that was it. That was the comment.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
randomness is that.
It's funny. It's odd. Especially because madness. And I think we'll get into this later, but madness will be triggered by very specific things, so it should have very specific outcomes, or at the very least more specific than. Out of nowhere, the giant spider freaked you so much out that you pass unconscious. Like, unless there's some background there that your character is afraid of spiders or had a terrible experience where their best friend was killed by a spider, that reaction, especially in a heroic setting, a heroic game, feels out of place. It feels just like Will mentioned. It just feels like this unfair obstacle that you're putting in front of your players that isn't fun for anybody. Like, the point is for it to be fun. It's not fun to be like, great, we spent 4 hours in real time diving down this dungeon, and now we have to just circle back and call it a day. Like, what? How is that fun? It's a no-brainer decision, and yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. What you were actually saying kind of goes back to what we've been doing on the podcast for our monsters is the demon lords. And a cool inclusion of that is that every demon lord has their own little madness table. So the madness you are driven to by the demon lords, very, very specific to the demon lord that's driving you to that madness.
Yeah, so
Cool.
that one definitely works really well. Unfortunately, a lot of them are like character ruining things. Like, my character loves murder. The only thing I want to do is just murder everyone now. It's like, all right, that's like, that character's done unless you just immediately cure it. You're not going to live with that for 3 sessions.
If they're a barbarian, they're like, nothing changed. I still remember one of our experiences with it, or I'm making this up, and if so, just go along with it and pretend it did happen, is when we were playing Out of the Abyss, our wizard got a indefinite madness. She kept rolling very poorly on the madness rolls, and Out of the Abyss does madness a little bit differently that we should bring up at some point here, as it has stacking effects as it's trying to be for a long-term campaign. And I believe she got the madness of that she discovered she really liked killing people. And that came up, and it was very, very hard for her to roleplay. And I think that's very hard for a lot of people to roleplay when they go out with the intention of having a lawful good character or chaotic good or whatever. I mean, alignment is not even something we use at our table, but the concept is there of, I don't like murdering people, and now this indefinite madness I got has completely changed my character, and it makes it, as you said earlier, Matt, a no-brainer decision, because you get that and you just go, yeah, we need greater restoration, because this can't last for more than 30 seconds before it becomes a problem, and just isn't fun for the player. And I think there's a lot that kind of twists into that, the randomness aspect of it, because why is that the specific madness that came up when everyone probably could have like agreed at the table? And this is not a hit at the person who was GMing at the time, because that was Ellie. No negativity towards your way. But that's something that everybody probably could have looked at and went, ugh, is that going to be fun? Is that going to enhance our game? Or is the player going to hate that? And is everybody else going to be annoyed by it more than they're going to be like, ooh, cool, new thing that we have to kind of weave around? And I feel like more so with the indefinite madnesses, you're going to run into that issue a lot of times where it might just legitimately not be a fun thing to roleplay if it makes no sense.
Yeah, and I think we ought to also mention, like we said at the top of the show, the first two are very mechanics focused. The last one, the indefinite one, is very roleplay focused. But if you're at a table with people who don't roleplay, there's like no consequence. There's no consequence to the indefinite madness. And I mean, you can try to push it, and you can try to push that agenda and be like, you love to murder people. You shouldn't be saving the like homeless right now. But at the same time, you gotta judge your table. If they don't use roleplay at the table at all, the indefinite madness has no more weight to it.
Right.
It almost makes...
the carrot and the stick are both the role play you get out of it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a fascinating choice that it doesn't come like accompanied with you know, you get indefinite madness, but you also have to roll on the long-term madness table for a mechanical effect or something like this. Like that would be interesting. Maybe if the indefinite madness and the long-term madness had rolls that we wanted to get out of it, I guess.
Right.
Right. No, if you're saying like 1 through 15, being drunk keeps me sane. Okay, fine. That's probably one of the, well, for some people, they might not want to do that at all, but that's the point of a session 0. Darn it, I did it myself. But that's, you pair
You
that.
can force your player to drink instead of the player character.
No. Stop.
No.
You might have it, again, paired with like the long term of the character suffers extreme paranoia. The character has a disadvantage on wisdom and charisma checks if they're not drinking. And that's kind of the mechanical aspect of it. It's like, if you're drinking, you don't have to worry about that. And drinking in D&D only gives like the poisoned condition if you're drunk, and that's probably its own thing to deal with as well. But at least bringing in that idea of, if you don't drink, hey, here is a mechanical negative that now comes from it, and that starts to feel at least a little more interesting. I still don't like that it can be cured with greater restoration, because that most power gaming players would be like, oh, a negative to my character sheet, let's get rid of that. But that at least could be the start of making it a little more interesting to me.
You chose an interesting one, because that is the easiest one to do, because it's very much an active thing. You drink, you avoid the negative repercussions. Whereas a lot of these other ones are just like, you feel a certain way, which is, some of these, it's almost impossible to, I think, even effectively portray at a table unless you're remarkably talented, and even harder to put any kind of mechanical thing to it. I don't like the way people judge me. If somebody judges you, you get disadvantage on...
Yeah, that takes a lot of effort from the probably from the GM to specifically have characters judge you now, or have the party, if the other players are leaning into it as well, they might be judging that player character. But that's not a thing that I normally equate with an average D&D session.
No.
Mm-hmm. To circle back on to Out of the Abyss, just to, because those rules are worth talking about. It's an optional on the optional rules. The madness is tiered, so everyone starts at madness level 0, and then throughout Out of the Abyss, it gives you a lot of options, a lot of opportunities of rolling madness. The campaign itself just tells you about it, and also within here, it gives you guidelines of, and if this happens, probably have them roll for madness. If they're level 0 and they fail, they go up to level 1, and then go up a level each time. And when they hit level 1, they get about short-term madness. Then the next time they fail, they get to level 2 and about a long-term madness, and the next time they fail, level 3, and get indefinite madness. And then they go back down to level 0. And so they can kind of keep going up and down through those ranks and keep tacking on these flaws, which I guess is an interesting idea. But again, that's where we ran into that situation where we had multiple characters in that campaign with long-term madness that just completely destroyed the characters, and we just kind of ignored it. We did just kind of let it go. Like I said, our wizard, Jared, I remember your character who was supposed to be like the really selfless paladin hero, got the one of, I feel I'm the strongest, best, most good-looking person in the room or something like that.
Yeah.
I remember you talking to me separately. It's like, yeah, this is really hard for me to play.
Right.
And then we found some reason to get rid of it, and that was that.
Yep. There you go. That one did definitely happen.
Yeah.
No, because I specifically was like, this isn't the character I set out to play. I wanted to play this specific archetype, and now we have this madness that's telling me to do the exact opposite. I think I did it for a little bit at least, and tried to lean into it, but yeah.
That's definitely one of these challenges, right? Like Will mentioned, unless you're incredibly talented role players, and let's be honest, I'm not, I like to think I'm good at it, but I'm not that good at it. And it makes it so hard. Like, how do you even role play some of these things? And when you're trying so hard, one philosophy that I have as a player whenever I play is, one of my primary responsibilities is to put on the skin of my character, to immerse myself in the world. And that's hard enough as it is, even with a straightforward character that's like, I'm going to save the little guy, I'm going to do my best to be like the hero of this village or whatever. Even something as straightforward as that can be difficult to do. And throwing in a curveball, like any of these mental health conditions that madness like kind of imposes, that's incredibly difficult, and it kind of takes you away. Like, it takes you out of the skin of your character and into a new character, which maybe this is it's a overarching statement for dealing with any kind of like ongoing mental health effects in any tabletop RPG, but it's definitely something to consider. It's tough. It's tough on players.
Yeah. And I think one way that I'll be talking about later on, but an idea of kind of combating that at least a little bit is the fact that these madness effects seem very, I guess binary is the best way to put it. It's like it starts and here it is, and now it's huge, and it's this thing that you can't not focus on. When you do have the I discovered I really like killing people, that's a really big part of your character, and you can't ignore that. The fact that there's no subtlety, there's no growth to the condition, whatever it may be, takes a lot of that energy, I think, or I guess adds a lot of that energy it takes to role play the scenario. It's because it doesn't start with you, when you kill someone, you just, like, one time, we'll say, it's not how I'd represent it mechanically, but you kill somebody and you noticed you really liked that. You enjoyed that more than you'd expect. And it gives the player time to grapple with it and kind of, like, maybe even talk it over with players around them and say, I think I'm getting really used to this. Do you ever get feel like we're just really good at this and it doesn't affect you in the way it used to? Because I think I kind of liked that. And then it's like a start of a conversation. When, again, as it's put in the indefinite madness, it's like, no, I love that. I'm going to love it the next time. I'm going to love it the time after that. And it's just great all the time. It's too much too fast.
For sure.
Go ahead, Ellie.
Go up next. I don't know how else to handle that, though, because, I mean, that's very much a role-playing choice, and I think that's a really good way to handle it and a lot more interesting. But you can't really write rules around that.
Well,
maybe just like a little bit of guidance, I guess.
Yeah.
And when you get long-term, let it ramp up over a week or something.
I think I
will
sentence. Bring that topic back up later when we talk about what we'd like to see, because I've got some ideas, but it would go down the rabbit hole I'm not trying to. So I guess, are we ready to talk about other games?
You were going to say something, man.
Oh, yeah, and actually, this might segue well. I think in the example of your Into the Abyss, or was that what you called it, Ellie?
Abyss, that's it.
Out of the Abyss.
Out of the Abyss, yeah.
In Out of the Abyss, there is at least the semblance of like a separate madness tracker. And I think that that's a step in the right direction. And that is exactly what I think other systems do even more concretely. So the systems that I feel handle madness or other effects similar to madness well are the ones that have a separate HP, like there's health points and then there's mental health points. And doing that and having that kind of enables this progression, because as you lose mental health points, there is like a concrete visual indicator to the player that, look, I'm losing my sanity here. You might, as a result of it, take on effects that are progressively worse and worse and worse because of it. Again, having a system tied to these effects that remind the player to roleplay them in a gradual way. So, yeah, maybe this is the time to talk about other systems. I don't know.
No, for sure. That's a great segue. And before we segue, I gotta say, if you're enjoying the episode, like, comment, subscribe, right? Yeah? All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can rate on Spotify now, so you guys should give Monsters and Multiclass a 5-star on Spotify if you haven't already.
Thank you.
So,
and then check out Roleplay Chat.
Look at that.
I know how hard it is to do for myself, so I'm doing it for you guys.
Thank you.
So other systems. I know that the two that I have played that deal with this, at least at all, whether or not well, I guess we'll get into, but Call of Cthulhu is one, and I think we all have a shared experience there. As Matt, you've played Call of Cthulhu, correct? And I've also played Mothership, which is a game that uses stress instead of sanity, which is trying to account for the same thing, the idea of growing tension in a horror-based setting. Great. So Call of Cthulhu, to start, who wants to kind of go over what those rules more or less are? Probably not as in-depth as we usually would, but the concept for people unfamiliar.
Yeah, Call of Cthulhu has a sanity stat. So it's a D100 system, so this obviously can't just be ripped out and applied to D&D. But you have a sanity stat, 0 through 100, and you start at a certain number, and it has rules about rolling it, and it's basically in D&D how you can kind of pros and cons of like lowering the stats to raise that one. Same sort of thing. You can start where you want. And then all throughout an adventure, you have to do sanity checks. You roll a D100, and if you get below your sanity level, you pass that check. If you get above it, you fail, or equal to and above. Not too critical. And then if you fail, you lose a number of sanity based on the check. And like pre-written adventures give you guides, what happens and stuff like that. If you lose, I think the number is 1/5 of your total sanity at the start, or from a check, you fall into this bout of temporary insanity where you lose control of your character and you have this really terrible effect, kind of similar to the short-term madness within D&D. And if you hit 0 on that track, you then do... No, I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up. Yeah, if you lose 1/5, you do the short term, and then that turns into a long-term madness or insanity, where it gives you very clear guides, like you get a new phobia or a new obsession or something like that. If you hit 0 on that level, you lose control of the character. The character essentially is... They don't die, but they no longer function.
Yeah, they basically need to be retired.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's hard to compare, right? Because Call of Cthulhu is sold as this horror game. Like that's what it is. And that's why it has a separate tracker for mental health, and it has a separate stat specifically allocated to it and things like this. But I think what I really like about it is that it has there's an instant effect that happens right now. It can be pretty dire, but it makes sense in a dire situation. And then it doesn't just disappear. It has a lasting effect on your character. It gives you this potentially permanent phobia of something. And it's also going to be relevant to what caused that bout of madness in the first place. I think it feels more realistic. It feels more impactful. Yeah, it's... I love it a lot more than the madness rules in D&D, if I'm being short and sweet.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. One thing that I'll slightly disagree with is I remember looking into it a while back of like ripping the sanity rules from Call of Cthulhu and putting them just right in D&D. That part's like a D100 roll, so it would definitely be awkward. I'm not saying for like mass use of the system, this is a great idea. But to some extent, you could just have everybody roll sanity. Either you do it as a D20 skill or you do it as a D100, and you just say sanity checks, you do a D100 and follow through with those. It still would give you the ability to kind of do those. Here's your short-term effect, and with that, here is now a role-playing consequence as well. And one thing with the phobias, if I remember correctly, is if you engage in one of those phobias, generally it means an additional sanity check. And it has that ability to kind of compound because you're now facing things that you've had to face in the past. Which
I think that's how it works.
I'm double checking it. Yeah,
I believe that's the point of the phobias. I don't remember the exact mechanical representation, but that's another thing that I feel like D&D's madness system kind of has lost. I mean, there's no way to represent the idea of like a specific thing is what has caused you pain in the past.
Right. And it makes it clear to roleplay too, right? You have this phobia, you're now afraid of this thing. And the next time your character runs into this, it's a little bit easier for the player to kind of to have that telegraphed and to build up to it and then roleplay it. So not only is there the mechanical, like it's mechanically presented in a better way, but it feels like a richer place for players to roleplay that and kind of prepare themselves ahead of time to be like, yeah, I'm scared of spiders and I'm seeing spider webs everywhere. I'm gonna start like cranking that crank of madness, and then when we face off against the monster, that's when it's gonna pop.
And I do like how there's kind of the build up with the sanity lessening, where it being a stat and it's being tied to 1/5 of your stat. And if there is another rule, if you lose just 5 at a time, you get like the 1d10 hours of temporary. It's almost the exact same thing as in D&D. But yeah, in terms of the 1/5, so if let's say you have 100 sanity, you have to lose 20 sanity at once to get a form of indefinite madness out of that. But then the campaign, which is probably not going to happen, then the campaign goes on and you keep taking small sanity damage here and there as your kind of willpower and your psyche slowly cracks over the course of the horrors that you see, because that's what Call of Cthulhu is all about, really. And then you get to one point where you're really low and you have 20 sanity left. At that point, all you have to do is lose 4 at a time. And so it's this, you could see it coming, I feel like, and at that point you would have had probably some buildups of bouts of temporary insanity that do go away after a short amount of time as you regain your composure. But your character's never quite the same because their total sanity score is lower, and it becomes easier and easier and easier because then it's also harder for them to pass sanity checks as well. So it's definitely a downward spiral, which could suck from a player's perspective, but from a game like Call of Cthulhu, where people I think have that buy-in, it's great. Where in D&D,
and it's meant to be
like,
shorter term, right? Like it's, or maybe not. Maybe I'm speaking out of my rear end here, but I feel like most of the times I've played Call of Cthulhu, it's with the expectation that my character isn't going to last a very long time.
Yes.
Maybe it's, what are they called? They're called
investigators.
Yeah. Well, no, not the people you play, but like a campaign or an arc has a special name. I forget what they're called, but it feels shorter. It feels like more condensed.
Mm-hmm. Right, but we're generally talking like 4 to 6 sessions, maybe, like even for some of the longer ones. And it's definitely the expectation, if you survive that and are able to continue adventuring, or whatever, again, you want to call it, you are part of a very small set of people.
Yes.
And
if you look into the rules of getting the sanity back, it just really drives home. This is a permanent resource that you're just not supposed to be able to claw this back. The entire game is almost built around your character descending rather than ascending. And that's why it works so poorly for D&D, because that's like the opposite of what most people are looking for.
I feel like I agree and disagree with that. Because, like, yes, that's what most people are looking for, but I feel like if you're introducing madness, then that's why you're introducing it, is because you are looking for a way to have a descent where maybe it's the type of game, it creates a new style of gameplay where you're both ascending in power, in physical strength, but maybe you're descending in other ways that need taken care of. And that's like a perfectly viable way to want to play D&D.
Sure. But the as written, just Dungeon Master's rules for madness really don't accomplish that, because again, it's just a binary, you pass or you fail. Right. And it's always the same chance for you, and unless you are raising your wisdom or charisma, that's usually actually even less of a chance.
It's probably worth noting the DMG does have a sanity score rule in it.
Yes.
It's not very interesting.
No, yeah. There's an area where they have 2 optional stats, honor and sanity. Honor's not relevant to this conversation. Sanity is what it sounds like. It's another D20 stat. It even gives you rules of if you want to incorporate this, you could add 3 points to the point buy or standard array of 11, or just roll for it. And then you would use that when you want to make a madness check, do a sanity save instead of a wisdom or charisma. And those stats are more likely to lower because there's written effects. But I think it does say if you get it for every indefinite madness, you lower it by 1 or something, which is getting there, but it still feels like it falls short. Yeah, not quite interesting.
And I think those come back from Greater Restoration too.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, Will, I kind of agree with you about how, we're comparing 2 games that tend to have different trajectories for their player characters. So maybe it's unfair, but I think that there's definitely things that we can learn as game masters right from Call of Cthulhu, and I suppose we can get to that later. But they become extremely hard to implement without carving away parts of the existing narrative in your D&D universe. Or at least in the universes that I've run. They're usually high fantasy. There's usually a lot of mages and clerics that are accessible to the players if they make the right connections. So unless I'm putting them in a dungeon where they're miles and miles away and they can't call on their friends and they can't teleport out of it and they can't do anything to, flee a situation to get help, then implementing this gradual descent into madness becomes feasible. But then it almost feels like we're not playing in the same game anymore. So it's tricky. It poses an interesting challenge to game masters. I also want to take the second to say I'm sorry if you can hear my toddler upstairs. It adds a little extra flavor. Maybe that's my slow descent into madness going on over here. But
that is par for the course for this podcast.
Very
frequently you can hear my son in the background. Making noise, laughing, screaming, what have you.
I kind of want to talk about another system. I kind of want to talk about Fate Core.
Please do, because I know nothing about this system.
So Fate Core is another system that tends to play best in short bursts. Like, it's not designed for super long-term campaigns. And I took some notes to quickly explain a little bit about how the system works. It's a system that uses fudge dice. So you have dice with 2 pluses, 2 minuses, and 2 nothings on the side. They're 6-sided dice, and you have 4 of them that you roll. And basically, that determines your success. You have skills, and you have bonuses to those skills. I'm not going to get into that. But the way that your health is tracked in the game is you have again 2 trackers. You have the physical health and your mental health, and both of those things have a cap. So there's your maximum amount that you can take damage, and as you get hurt, you can tick off your HP or your mental health. But if you go above that, if you get damaged over your maximum, then you have these things called stress markers that you fill in. And the stress markers go from mild to extreme, so there's 4 of them. And what I really, really like about the system is that whenever you take one of these stresses, the table will collectively decide what that stress ought to be. So a very simple example, let's say you're fighting something and you fall and you take physical damage that's above your HP total. You now have to take a mild physical stress. Let's say you have like a road rash on your arm. You write that down on your character sheet, and until it's cured, which I'm not gonna, it's a little harder to cure these things in the system, but still, once it's cured, it's gone. But until it's cured, it can be called upon by enemies to get advantages against you. So if they're attacking you and choose to attack you on your wound, or if you have you take mental damage and they poke at your phobia and they find a way to take advantage of that, they actually get a benefit out of it. Same thing with you as a player. If you lean into it, you could get what's called inspiration, which is not inspiration. You get a fate point, which is like inspiration. That allows you to reroll things and gets benefits. So what I really like about this is that, one, it's a collaborative approach to building your stresses. And so in the case of madness, you can pick a phobia, you can pick some kind of mania, you can pick some kind of effect that makes sense based on the situation. And then the second thing that I really enjoy about this is that it kind of becomes part of your character's descriptions. It becomes part of your, in D&D, you've got these background elements and you've got these aspects of your character that are core to who they are. You're adding to this. You're adding temporary core values or core elements of your character that have mechanical input. Like, you can call upon those things to be at a disadvantage or at your own advantage, depending on the situation, which is kind of neat, I find. I don't know if that makes sense. I oversimplified it.
No, that makes sense. One of the questions I have is the idea of a enemy calling on whatever that is the idea that the GM, the person running the game, is the enemies are supposed to inherently know that, or is it just if they find out about it and are able to play off of it?
Yeah, you as the game master, you have to decide. You're not going to meta game that the archer all the way in the back is going to know that maybe you have a busted knee.
Okay.
Or you have to use a reasonable grounds to believe that character would
Sure.
know that happened.
To give it, I guess I'm sure an example, like if they see that you like lean into your disadvantage, and so you say that you hobble in, so your speed is, I don't know, you're slower to get into the battle, then maybe they would notice, hey, they're hobbling, let me use that to my advantage, that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not super crippling, but it's still, it's still this quasi-permanent thing that you have to go and get treated. Unless you're playing with magic users that can heal it, the system enables you to kind of do whatever you want. So you could have a high fantasy setting where you've got a mage who can heal you or a cleric who can heal you, but you can also make that impossible to have. And what I like too is it has this growth, right? If you have a mild injury first, you know that the next one coming is going to be worse. They're going to kind of compound. You can kind of see it coming. And it kind of enables this progression to degression. I don't know, descent into madness, if that's what you want your mental health stresses to be, which is kind of fun. Honestly, the hardest part of that system is just coming up with like relevant, is like coming up with a tag for each individual thing. But I would, even if you're not, you never plan to play with this system, I would encourage people to go look up, examples of mental health stresses in the Fate system, because they could act as great inspiration. I wrote some down that kind of like go from, mild to extreme, where you've got something like spooked, or maybe you've got a little bit of a crisis of your own confidence. But then as you get worse, you could become, anxious or unhinged, or continue down that trail of now you're starting to get paranoid, you're starting to get maddened, you're starting to get hysterical, you can create phobias. So you can start with a very small mental stress that gets attached to your character. But as the play goes on, and as you encounter worse and worse things, your health track is going to go down, you're going to have to take more and more stress, and eventually you're going to descend into madness. So I find that kind of fun. Yeah, and there's also extreme things that you can take when you get this last level, the extreme ones are permanent. So you're forced to replace one of your core character aspects with something that's related to that extreme stress, and that you're never going to get rid of. That's going to be part of your character forever, which is, a good or a bad thing depending on what you're aiming for. But yeah, that's the Fate core system. Very narratively focused. It needs that the player buy-in also to take advantage of their stresses and things like that, or to act them out. But the beauty of it is if they don't, that's fine. They just have less HP. It's only a mechanical element. But if they do lean into it and they do role play, and maybe they role play something that's to the detriment of the rest of the party because of it, well, you have a mechanic where you give them a fate point. You give them this equivalent to inspiration for that. And there's no cap. You can keep giving people fate over and over and over again to encourage them to kind of use those, to act those things out.
Yeah, and I really like that, at the very least, that idea of leaning into the negative in order to get something positive out of it later. It's something that can encourage the roleplay, even if the party is generally less excited about it. It's like I was saying earlier with the indefinite madness, the roleplay is both the carrot and the stick. This here offers both a reason that you don't want to lean into it, but also a reason why you do want to lean into it. And it makes it a more interesting choice all around, and makes it a thing that you're constantly thinking about. Like, it's almost its own stat, the negatives that you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun for that exact reason.
I like the table coming together to decide what form it takes. I think D&D could do more of that. I mean, obviously people could just do that, but like, give people a little guidance to that step. To write it in various rules or in adventures. Have the table come up with whatever's happening here. And then I really love the enemies being able to use it against the player. That's really cool. Do you ever see it the other way, where the GM
Absolutely.
will make an enemy that has something like this and give the players a chance to
Yeah. So I
Okay.
mean, we kind of homebrewed it because I don't think it's not part of any official rules that I've found. But absolutely, you can make if you hit an enemy with something extremely hard or some attacks we've like homebrewed so that when you use this spell or you use this thing, if you roll a certain thing, like a critical, for instance, you now inflict a stress on this enemy. And now that you know that you did something to them, let's say you've gashed open their stomach and now they've got like their guts are hanging out. This is an example of a pretty extreme one, but their guts are hanging out, they're barely hanging on. You can do the finishing blow and get yourself a bonus to that next time you get an opportunity to do so. So it's it goes both ways, or at least at my tables we've had it go both ways. I'm sure there's somebody out there who's made official, unofficial rule sets for that.
Yeah, I think that would add a cool dynamic, even if it's something your party doesn't do to the enemy. Just when you build an encounter, say here's 10 bandits, and this one has this issue, and bandit B has this issue, and just an extra dynamic thing, especially to split up and add differences in when you're fighting.
Yeah,
So I think
and
that's really cool.
It also bleeds into social aspects, right? Like you can have a stress, like when you have a stress that's a mental stress, for instance, let's say it's something like you have a hard time talking up in a crowd. Well, you can lean on that in a non-combat situation. And have a mechanical advantage or disadvantage because of it. So your social encounters, your like puzzly encounters where you're talking to somebody, trying to get them to say something, that NPC can have baggage. You can give that NPC these stresses, and if the players figure it out and kind of push the right buttons, they can get advantages to figure out befriend them or make them their enemy or get the information out of them or whatever.
Yeah, that's really neat. I like that.
Cool, that's it. That's all I have to say for Fate. So I'll pass it on. What's this Mothership game that you guys were talking about?
Yeah. So Mothership is a sci-fi horror game, and it's currently going through some revisions to come out a beautiful first edition. And one of the key aspects of the game that I immediately took to when playing it is this concept of stress. And stress is, again, used to, in the same way that madness is. It's this idea that you are getting more unsettled with the current situation. And the overall rules for it are that everybody starts at 2 minimum stress, and I believe you can affect that number in one way or another, but everyone starts at 2 minimum stress, and as you go throughout your adventuring day, let's call it, you will have to make stress tests. And when that happens, let me go back. They changed it for first edition. Every time you fail at something throughout the course of the adventure, you gain a stress. So the idea of I try to open a door and you fail at it, well, that is a stressful situation, and so you gain at least 1 stress in those situations. Nothing bad happens immediately from gaining stress. The later it can be used to improve your character, that's a whole thing that's not directly related to this. But the idea that failure and pressure kind of leads to growth is neat, but that's, again, not important for this. But as they go through the adventure, if something really traumatic happens, the player has to make a panic check. And when that happens, they roll a d20. If they are above their stress level, then nothing happens. But if they roll below it, they panic. And at that point, you'll roll on basically a short-term madness table. I'll say it's kind of a combination of both that has some conditions on it that can be long-term and some short-term ones that maybe, again, just you're paralyzed for a minute, whatever that might be. So it's that idea of just kind of growing tension throughout the adventure that I really appreciated anytime I've done it. And what I liked about it from a more long-term perspective, regardless of the growth parts from it, is the fact that usually to get rid of the stress, it's a long-term process of either being in a comfortable situation and rolling against your stress to try and lower it, or actually working with people, either, your party in game or with a therapist if you're like on shore leave or something, to try and lower that stress, get rid of a condition, and overall to kind of take it and move on from it. So that works very well, I think, for like, it's definitely not for super long, multi-year campaigns, but for shorter, 3 to 4 week type, or I guess session style games. I think it can be really interesting seeing that, again, slow descent, as we've brought up in a couple of other instances.
So it seems like the common thread I'm hearing between all these different systems is the cumulative effect, the slow descent, the downward spiral. That D&D's Madness, to tie back to that, really is lacking. The Out of the Abyss rules of the levels stacking on top of each other kind of do it, but it still feels odd. And because it's still just like everybody's handles it the same. Level 1, then level 2, then level 3, and then back down to level 1, 2, 3. It's not like you have this score where it gets harder or easier to pass or fail as it goes on or anything like that. It just is. It's very static throughout.
Yeah, and with them being, again, so large, like even if you accumulate 3 or 4, it quickly gets to the point that the character becomes almost just a mess to even try to play. Where I think a lot of other systems, it's stuff that can be subtle and can be brought up at appropriate times. I think the way that Madness tries to go about this is it's with a sledgehammer, and that's just not subtle enough to be a fun mechanic. A terribly fun mechanic. It has its times.
No, I'm laughing. You're saying it kind of hits it like a sledgehammer and it's not subtle. I was like, I realize that's kind of 5th edition D&D. There's like no subtlety. Like, I love it. Love 5th edition D&D. We play it every week. We have a podcast around it. No plans on quitting the system. But yeah, it does not do subtlety and nuance in its rules well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's hard for it to do that, especially when we're talking about, mental effects. When there isn't, like, I mean, sure, you can do wisdom saves, but, like, you don't have a tracker for your mental well-being. You don't have that. So I feel like without introducing something like that, it's always going to be not as good. Like, it's always going to be a second to a system that has those things, which is fair. Like, that's not where the focus is, I guess.
Right.
I suppose... At the very least, I would hope that when players are faced with situations with madness, and even in a D&D setting, that they take it a little bit on themselves. Like, I think there's a little bit of this unspoken rule that the players need to take it on themselves to do, like you said, Jared, make that slow descent into madness. Maybe start acting mad before they're even affected by anything, just to react to characters that they've killed or monsters that they've faced and the horrors of what they're doing in a roleplay situation. The problem is when there isn't a mechanic to reinforce that, a lot of players might not do it, especially if they don't care. If they don't care, or they don't know to do it, or they're just not experienced enough. Like, I've had players where even without being turned mad, they start to act mad when they are faced with some kind of horrific monstrosity, because it's just easier to flip a switch and be mad than it is to do that gradual progression. So it's I'm not really sure what I'm saying here, but
no, that's all right.
But
well, let's kind of, I guess, use this to move into what we would want to see from 5th edition. Again, does not have to be like, here's our fully fleshed out Madness rules we just created on the fly. But we've talked a lot about what it does well, because there are some things that are good, and what it doesn't, and how maybe some people could be inspired to utilize it in their games. And I think the big one that we've talked about so far is this idea of subtlety and growth, or I guess the opposite of growth, whatever we want to, however we want to phrase that. Yeah, regression. Thank you. Ungrowth. Thank you, Will.
Ungrowth, yes.
Always look to you for the best words.
I know a few of them.
So one thing that... Oh, go ahead. You start.
Okay, so despite how much we've been bashing just madness in D&D, I think in certain situations, then it could actually be fine. It's like, it's good enough. I'm thinking if you have a long-term campaign and you want to do a temporary tonal shift, because maybe it's October and you kind of get everyone's buy. It's like, yeah, let's do like the spooky, creepy stuff for the month of October. And it's going to be a real tonal shift from what we've been doing. And hey, let's throw in these madness rules just to really add to it and give it that kind of oomph. And it's admittedly kind of a cartoony oomph. I guess, yeah, we could have said that. I could have said that when we first started discussing it. The madness rules in D&D feel very cartoony. And that could be fine.
Yeah.
You know, you're playing your high fantasy campaign and your heroic characters, and for a couple sessions you get thrown into a haunted house and there's spooky ghosts and skeletons pop out, and it's this real campy, cartoony, horror style thing, and everyone's having fun of, yeah, let's throw the madness rules on for 2 sessions. And they just play it up and do all this crazy stuff happens, and then it ends. That's fine. I think that's perfectly... The madness rules works for that. Trying to like retrofit sanity 1 through 100 Call of Cthulhu rules onto it for 3 sessions is just too much.
That's perfectly reasonable. I couldn't agree more. And I think I have used it for spooky one-shots, and I guess I really don't have any complaints for it in those scenarios. And even then, the long-term madnesses, avoiding ones that just completely shut down the character, also generally work fine in those situations, if they even come up, which they might once during it come up.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I agree with what was said, what Jared and Ellie said, but I also think that if I'm going to implement madness, and in instances I have, I'm going to make changes, and I would encourage people to at least think on those changes in that, the remove randomness. Just don't roll on a table.
Yeah.
You can look at the table and be like, yeah, this one applies the best right now. But I would just don't make it random. Like it's too, like you said, like a hammer coming down with like, oh, here's this effect that has nothing to do with the fact that you were terrified out of your mind by this enormous squid monster. Like that, I don't know.
Right.
Another piece that I would caution against is implementing things that only have one of the 2 axes of roleplay versus mechanic. You don't want it to be a strict mechanic disadvantage. You don't want it to be a strictly roleplay inspiration for roleplay. You kind of want it to be this middle ground where it's doing 2 of these things at once, and it doesn't have to be too much. But even something as simple as saying like you are rendered unconscious for 1d10 times 10 hours, and then after that you have recurring nightmares of this thing. Just add in a little bit of flavor to spark plug that roleplay, because it's not going to come natural to everybody.
Sure.
So that would be my other piece of, I guess, recommendation or advice.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think a big one with that idea of removing the randomness, I think what I would want to do if I was going to seriously consider this for a longer term game is I would probably work to put together a table, and this is on the high effort side of things. I'd put together a table of these starter effects of kind of things that would replace in Maya's the short-term madness, and use that as like a growth point. So I wouldn't roll on a table when it comes up, but I'd look at it and I'd say, all right, if the horrifying thing is because it's gruesome, well, here's an effect that is now going to be the short-term madness for being terrified of gruesome thing. Maybe they gain a phobia of that specific thing, whatever, but then the long-term madness to me would need to be a direct line of you start here, and then this is what the next step is, and here is what the indefinite part of it is. To give an example, let's say, can't think of what would cause the effect, but let's say hallucinations. That's what you want to go with for the short-term effect. At the start of it, hallucinations can be really kind of just like a mild inconvenience at worst, and you think it's a trick of the eye. And that's something that is just a good place to start, where the player isn't, they're not seeing a giant flying purple elephant at all times, and everybody thinks that they've lost their mind immediately. It's like you see something out of the corner of your eye in your peripheral vision, and maybe for 1d6 rounds when you first experience whatever this event is. You're blinded by these hallucinations, but then they go away, and you kind of are able to process it and given that time. And then you get that second level, and it's every time you fail this or whatever, you see that specific hallucination or hallucinations around that thing again, lasting, 6 minutes. And during that time, it's something like you have disadvantage on perception checks while the hallucinations are active. And then, you ramp it up to that top level, whatever it may be. And from there, it's like the hallucinations are constantly happening. You're having a hard time discerning what's real, what's not. And it still doesn't need to be a mechanical effect that's going to ruin you. Maybe it's just disadvantage on all perception checks that rely on sight. And it's never giving you anything that's so bad that you're just like, wow, adventure day over. Because I think that's a huge thing that was missed, as we were saying earlier. It's all, not all of them, but a lot of them are so drastic that they become immediately needing to be dealt with, and it loses what can make it interesting and giving the player time to roleplay it and want to grow with it, or I guess ungrow with it, to steal a word from earlier.
And I think you touched on something, right? You want them to embrace it. You want them to have this effect, to be a part of their character that ungrows with their character. And honestly, I think a great way to do that is to incentivize it, to find a way. Inspiration is the perfect mechanic for this. Give players inspiration when they start to do things that, leans into the fact that they have this newfound madness. And if you're making it gradual, they're going to kind of learn how to play with that. They're going to learn how to incorporate that into their character in a natural way that feels like it's not too immersion breaking and doesn't like betray the thought or the picture they have of who their character is.
Yes. I
Pulling
love
on that thread
point.
a little bit, I want to definitely say what you were saying, Jared. That's very right. You create these paths. That's important. I think it's important to realize how just grossly inadequate these tables are. They're just nothing here. I don't want to say that. These are fine, but this is 12 things. 12 flaws. There are more flaws than that. And that's the thread I think you should pull. You should create these paths that you find effective and appropriate for your game based off of the challenges they'll face, but also create threads based off of the characters at your table. Not everyone comes to the table with flaws, but at the table, they usually show something like a personality quirk or something you can pull on. And you can use that as a great starting point for a madness that they might be more comfortable stepping into.
Like making that flaw larger in a way that they weren't originally intending.
Because it's always easier to amplify a feature than graft it on.
Yeah.
Like you said, like it like ruins your character's skin suit when something new is added to it. But if you add more of it, more of what you already have, it's so easy to just kind of embrace it and go farther than you normally would have.
Sure.
I really like that. That's really cool. And it almost begs this conversation to be had with your players again. But like, if madness happens, at the end of the game, take that player aside and be like, okay, how would your character react to this? What's in their personality already that we can explode, that we can really explore in this new interesting dimension? And it almost becomes like this game master to player collective collaborative approach to figure out that trail. I really like that, Will. That's really cool.
Yeah. And going on that even more, this is by no means something that can be codified and again put into a 5th edition book and put to the masses. But that idea of making it a collaborative thing for the entire table, even where you all kind of talk about it for a little bit and say like, hey, this character just experienced this thing. How do we all think that we could make this interesting for them? And obviously the player gets their own input as well. It's not like a jury of people deciding. You are now sentenced to hallucinations for the rest of your character's life. But that idea of like everybody kind of figuring out together and how it could, I think then later GM to player one-on-one, more of like, okay, now how's that going to affect them long term? But even just coming up with like, what do you guys think that, they just saw a slime monster explode and then, I don't know, a bunch of eyeballs popped out on it. And now everyone's like, well, okay, maybe they, don't like looking people in the eyes. great. Okay, that's the first thing. You have disadvantage on persuasion checks now if you're face to face with somebody, and everyone goes, okay, is that like, can we agree with that? Is that good enough? Is that too strong? Whatever. And it's not something you're going to create a table for. You won't think of absolutely everything that might ever happen, but you all agree we're going to come up with a role playing thing, and we're going to make a light mechanical effect at first and make it grow with time. And add in that idea of, if you lean into it, you get inspiration. And maybe inspiration in its current state doesn't fully support that, because you can only have one inspiration at a time, and that's all weird. But that's a different conversation entirely. But let's say inspiration is the route you take because that's simple, that's already set up. That's great. I mean, it gives people that direct line to how they want to play it out.
Yeah, another little tidbit that I think might be cool, especially like if you're making your own tables, you're making your own trails of these effects. I would encourage people to go look into like psychology, like the effects of fear and why we're afraid of things. I feel like there's a lot to be gleaned from that. Can I say that? Anyway,
we don't actually allow that word to be used.
Words,
no,
that's
gleaned,
okay.
yeah.
If we use unfair or what is it?
Ungrow.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, and but yeah, go look up fear. Why there's the types of fear. From what I can remember, there's some cool ones where it's like fear of the unearthly, fear of pain and suffering, fear of fear of disease and sickness, fear of the ungodly, or like religious based fears. So leaning in on what those things are and kind of going to the core of why certain people are afraid of certain things, I think can be useful. Again, it's a very high level of effort to create if you're just doing like a one shot. But if you're doing a whole arc and you want to have a specific enemy at the end that's this grotesque, ungodly monster, maybe you lean on the like religious aspect and look for religious based fears in history and things like this. I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit.
No, that's okay. You're more than welcome to ramble. That's why we're here. I think that's a great idea. And maybe it's not something you're able to do, again, keeping that idea of like, don't go out and try to research every single fear ever. That's going to be difficult. But when certain things come up, that's a good place to turn to. It's like, all right, what is that phobia kind of, just not distilled, but more like in its scientific nature, and then you can look into that, you can research that, it's available.
I think there's one more aspect to this we need to discuss or bring up, and that's the common criticism to all this, where we're like jump through all these hoops about, let's pull from these different systems and apply it to D&D, and how are we going to fix all this, of just, well, why don't you just play one of those other systems?
It's a good question.
It depends on what you're going for. I mean, entirely,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, if that is the main focus, then yes, it can be very difficult to justify, near impossible to justify why you would choose D&D over something else. But if you, I don't know, I guess I'll take offense to that. Not like an actual offense, but from the perspective, because I like it and I know it and I like every other aspect of it. It's just this one thing that I don't like. And so if there's a way that it can be done with actual, let's say, without a sledgehammer, if there's a way that can be done a little bit with even what we've talked about, I feel like it's not something that's going to be like, wow, this needs a total rewrite of the entire system, and now we need sanity scores, and now we need this. It's just like small things to add on. That's just like I guess a really big part of the OSR movement, old school revival, I think it is. It's this idea that no game that's made for you is going to figure out every single aspect that you want to touch on with the game you want to play. And we're all game designers. Every time we sit down to GM, we are making things up, either encounters or rules because something's not established already. And there's nothing wrong with just throwing something in if it fits the rest of your idea. I like high fantasy, and I like the combat of D&D, but I don't like madness. Well, you should play Call of Cthulhu. That's not even a little bit the same. That's a totally different tone.
To add to that... Oh, no, go ahead, Ellie.
No, go on.
So yeah, to add to that, I think part of the reason why I think this conversation is so interesting is because obviously we're all passionate about Dungeons and Dragons. We think it's a solid, strong system. It's got its flaws, but it's also got its merits. And I think that sums up the madness rules. You know, it's a starting point, but it doesn't feel fully complete. It feels like it's not reaching up to its full potential in that it's not always encouraging all of the right things all of the time. And it doesn't have that build up, and, you know, it's missing some parts. So I think there's enough that we can graft on. There's enough that we can kind of fiddle with for this to work well without forcing your table to learn a new rule set, without completely extracting yourself from your setting or your characters. So I think this is the reason to still use madness in D&D. Like, use it, just be aware of its shortcomings. And then if you find that your table is really enjoying it, then I think it's time to start considering, do we want to have a horror-based game in another setting?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's too big of a pill to swallow right off the get-go. Like, hey, I want to try madness. Let's immediately abandon D&D and jump to something else. You know, I know you're not saying to do that, but
right.
Anyway,
No,
to take the offense that I'm not taking.
Right.
No, I agree with you too, perfectly, 100%. I was bringing it up because it's a really common response right now to any criticism in D&D of people kind of like theory crafting, like, oh, what if we like make this tweak or something, of people coming in like, no, just play this game. Why would you? There's all these systems that do it better, so why don't you just pick one of those? And I hope I don't regret diving into this, because I know it's become like a really, really popular answer to any D&D discussion in the community.
I could already hear the mad. They're mad already.
And say all this to say, I highly encourage playing other systems. We wouldn't be able to have this discussion if we'd only ever played D&D. I mean, that's just
totally.
the long and short of it. You learn
Right.
a lot from playing other games, but if the tone you want is met by D&D 95% of the way, and I'll say this for any system, regardless of D&D, if 95% of the tone you want is met through Call of Cthulhu or Fate Core, is that like, not sure if I'm transposing this.
Fate
Okay.
Core.
If 95% of what you want is there, and all you have to do is make one little tweak and not, you know, throw away the entire system, then that's okay if it works for your table. Like, that's literally all that matters.
Right, exactly. Yeah, like like I said, really like the combat, which is a huge part of D&D, and like that's a very core thing too. It's like, all right, let's not throw all of that out, because like Call of Cthulhu combat, for instance, is kind of clunky. It's kind of awkward.
It's
It does not
clunky.
It does not have the D&D feel to it. And it's
Oh,
like, so
the
you
same
want
thing
that
can be said for Fate. Fate
Yeah.
combat is not nearly as intense or has as many options as
Right.
D&D. D&D just has this plethora of choices, character builds and stuff. It's people might come at me for this, but it's designed to be a combat simulator.
Right.
You know, there's roleplay tossed into there, and we can have fun with that. But at the end of the day, it shines the brightest when you're facing monster after monster, combat after combat, and you're going through this dungeon that you're peppering things into. So, yeah, it's if that's what you like, there's no sense to move away from it.
Right.
right.
Somebody told me once, I forget who, but it's like D&D is a hammer. Right? Like we said, to go back to the analogy that we said before, it's a hammer. But like in the real world, you can use a hammer for a lot of stuff. It's designed for certain things, like hammering in nails. But you could also use a hammer to like scratch your back if you want. It's not the
Open
best tool
cans.
for it. Yeah. It's
Get
not
into
the
your
best tool,
car.
but you can do it. And like if you graft on some peripherals to it, it'll do it even better. So
Look at this.
if you want
My
to stick
hammer
with the
does
hammer,
algebra. Like, okay, weird, but if that's what you really want to do with your hammer, who am I to stop you?
For a second, I do want to kind of speak to the people that are advising, try another game. Try another game. Everybody should try just new stuff all the time. That's what life is for. But B, if you're looking at the Call of Cthulhu rules as a DM and you're reading through this 15 pages of complex sanity rules and think, I need all of this in my game. Your game's not D&D, it's Call of Cthulhu. And I advise you try it, because the backbone of Call of Cthulhu is the sanity rules. And that's kind of why they're so good. And if you rip the backbone out of one thing and try and stick it in another, it's not going to combine like a hammer and a screwdriver. It's going to be a hammer and a ham sandwich. It's just, These are not complementing each other.
Both have ham in it, so I'm pretty sure they're delicious.
Carpet.
No, and that's fair, and I think it really does that criticism or suggestion, whatever you want to call it, of go play a different game. I think it needs to come from the right place, but it also needs to be, I guess, understood that if the tone you're looking for is met by this other game better, then great, go and do it. That is fine and should be encouraged. But if the tone can't be met by this other game, like, again, to give the example of, I want to play a high fantasy game where it's horror based and it's going to matter long term, not just for 2 sessions, but for an entire campaign, I do not know of any games where that is met. And if I played Call of Cthulhu, that would not be met. If I played Pathfinder, that's not going to be met. It's the idea of, like, at some point you might be looking for something too specific to have been made. And if it has been made, great. And maybe it does it well, or maybe it does it really poorly, because I've read a lot of bad TTRPG rules.
Even if it has been made, but you don't want to play it. So what? It's like, yeah, it's okay. Like, this is your hobby. This is your escapism. This is your relaxation time. If you just want to stick what you're comfortable with and tweak some rules to make this aspect work, that's fine. Or especially if you can't get your players buy-in, I know it's definitely not uncommon to have tables where, like, the DM's the one who's super into it and the players they're having fun, but ultimately they do just want to show up and play and never think about it. Then, like, trying to pitch, like, all right, here's a core rulebook, a 300-page core rulebook of another game you need to read for next week. It's like, it's not going to happen.
Right, like, I'm still getting my players to remember what their attack roll actually is, and you want me to sit here and try and teach them and hire another game, which most are not the length of D&D. I think D&D rules are kind of an exception in terms of length. Most you can get the gist of it in 30 pages, but that's still a lot.
Yeah, and it's still another thing for somebody to go and buy. You know, it's and I don't want the internet to come at me saying that you support your indie tabletop RPG creators, please do, but you can't support all of them. You only have money is finite for everybody. So yeah, sometimes you've got your stuff, you want to stick with it. By all means, stick with it.
Just recognize the implications of it. Again, if you try to put Call of Cthulhu Sanity into D&D, it's probably going to be awkward. It's not going to be flawless, and you might need to change it over time. All of that is fine too. Everything is a process. It doesn't need to work right out the gate. Take what works well, use it. Throw out what doesn't. Make your hammer sandwich.
All right. So I know that was my deviation, but we did get really off topic of madness specifically. Was there anything else on that? I think. Is that an episode?
I think that's an episode. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's probably good for an episode. As usual, if you enjoyed...
Before that, actually, Matt, if you want to say again... Do a little pitch about where people could find you and stuff.
Yeah, that's probably... You're a better host
now that people have listened to you talk longer instead of right at the beginning.
Yeah, if you guys thought it was insightful enough to listen to another time, I'd encourage you to come find me on Roleplay Chat. We're available on all podcasting platforms. Season 3 kicks off in mid-February, so I'm currently on hiatus, just taking a break from editing and all of that fun stuff. But yeah, come listen in. February 16th, I think. Episodes drop every second Wednesday. And I'm joined by guests, of the community, people on Twitter. Jared joined me for a fun conversation not too long ago, talking about multi-classing.
I changed some minds. I remember that.
Yeah, exactly. You also said something that apparently your co-hosts here might disagree with, but you said you were the self-proclaimed master of multi-class. So
it was self-proclaimed. They can't disagree with it. Also, they don't ever listen to anything I'm on. So could you please not spill those beans?
But yes, please come find the show. It's a lot of fun. And if you also want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so. That's at Role with the ROLE _play_chat, where I tweet all kinds of things related to tabletop RPGs. I like doing polls where people vote on different polls to see. I like to post very polarizing things to see which of the two outcomes is the winner. So that's a lot of fun. But yeah, thanks for having me on the show. This was a lot of fun. I wish you guys all the best for this new chapter of Monsters in Multiclass. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and thank you so much for coming on. Seriously, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, links to all that in the descriptions.
Of course. And your insight was wonderful, and you were indeed the expert on madness. There it is. That's super not true. But I'll also
add it to my CV.
Yeah. As usual, if you enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow wherever you get your podcasts, whatever they specifically call it, rate it, all those lovely things. If you want to find us and the show, you can go to monstersofmulticlass.com/support. And today we're going to talk about our affiliates, Metallic Dice Games, because they're great. And you can go to metallicdicegames.com and use the code MM10 to get 10% off dice and dice accessories. I will keep the promo bit shorter today because we've talked enough. And as usual, thank you to our patrons, Jeff W., Joe P., Vincent M., Isaac M., Sentinel D20, Star Shinobi, Adam A., Ed G., Bob F., Craig A., Brian H., and Luca L. You all are amazing. And that's it. That's the episode.
Yep. Yeah. And as always, thanks for watching.
Bye.